God dwells in you. Let us pray. Most holy and loving God, thank you. Thank you for your unyielding presence with us. Thank you for loving us so much that you refuse to let us go. Thank you for being among us as a spirit of courage, a spirit of wisdom, a spirit of challenge. Thank you for your call to us to be church in powerful ways and to follow Christ in powerful ways. And thank you for the love that you have for each of us and all of your children that gives us the fuel to get the job done. Amen. Welcome. It is phenomenal to be here this morning. Everyone turn and wave at the camera. Welcome to everyone streaming online. If you're new at All Saints or visiting us this morning, we hope that you sign one of the green contact sheets near the doors, pick up a red welcome bag, which are on the lawn, fill out the welcome cards that are in there. I don't want to spend a lot of time talking because I want to make sure that we have as much time as possible for our speaker, for the Reverend Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas. She is a scholar, an activist, a theologian, a seminary dean, a canon at National Cathedral, and an amazing author, and a prolific author. We have only 2 of her books. She has many more available, but I recommend both of them to you. One is Sexuality and the Black Church, a Womanist Perspective. The other is Stand Your Ground, Black Bodies and the Justice of God. Both of these are available over at the book table on there. For those of you who are watching around the country, they're available online, but they're also available, I'm sure, at your local independent bookseller. And so please patronize your local independent bookseller. And really, I want to just say it is just such an honor and a privilege to have you here, and just ask you to welcome the Reverend Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas.
Thank you, Reverend Kinman, and thank all of you all for being here today. And as I said earlier, I am really happy to be here and grateful for your what has been very warm hospitality. But I have to confess the truth. I am even more grateful for being here because of your very warm weather. Given from where I have come in New York. So this is paradise. I want to spend most of this time this morning in conversation and in dialogue with you, but let me try to set the table a little bit for the things that I hope we will engage in our conversation together. This forum was titled, God's Justice When Whiteness Stands Its Ground, right? So, I hear this. Anybody ready to get off the plane yet? No. So what does that mean? When whiteness stands its ground. What do I mean by whiteness? As I look out, and there are many of you who happen to look like white Americans, Or is there a difference between happening to look like a white American and acting like one? Fine line, and this is what I want to talk about when I'm talking about whiteness standing its ground. What it means to not simply look like a white American, but to act like one. So in order to understand that, it seems to me that we have to understand something very fundamental about our country in this nation of ours. And that is that this country really has never decided, yet to decide whether or not it is going to be, well, and I will explain it in a few moments, an Anglo-saxon nation, where whiteness indeed stands its ground, or whether or not it's truly going to be a nation for the huddled masses who yearn to be free. That decision has not yet been made. Are we going to be a nation that lives into the legacy of slavery or not? W.E.B. Du Bois once described the African American as one with a warring soul, whether to be African or American. Well, this nation can be described in such ways as well. A nation with a warring soul. So, when I talk about this nation as an Anglo-saxon nation, here's what we just have to be clear when we're talking about who we are as a nation. When it was founded, indeed when its Pilgrim and Puritan forebears crossed the ocean, they truly believed that they were carrying forth the legacy of an ancient Anglo-Saxon people from the ancient woods of Germany. They believed that. They believed that they were called to carry forth what they thought was this people's distinctive love for freedom, as well as their unique moral conscience. Right? And so they intended to build a nation that was culturally, that was politically, if not demographically, a reflection of their Anglo-Saxon forebears. And here's the thing. Our very founding fathers believed the same. I won't go into all of the details. I invite you to read further about that, not to try to sell my book. You can look at stuff online if you don't want to buy it. But I go into much further detail about that, for which we don't have time today. But the thing to know is that the city on the hill that our founding fathers and Puritan and Pilgrim forebears intended to build was a city that was to be a monument to Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism. Period. American exceptionalism was equivalent to Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism. The Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist Toni Morrison puts it this way. She says, deep within the understanding of America is race. It's at the center of who we are. That's who we intended to be. This nation was intended to be a nation that carried forth Anglo-Saxon ways, culture, and was comprised of Anglo-Saxons themselves. But now you might think, but everybody that looks like an Anglo-Saxon isn't an Anglo-Saxon. That's true. There is a vexing problem in this country from its very beginnings. This is an immigrant country. From its very beginnings. Those Puritan and Pilgrims that came, well, they were immigrants. Then that's being nice to say who they were when they came to this land. Right? It is fundamentally an immigrant country, which means this, that even many of those who came from Europe were not Anglo-Saxon. And we know that, right? And so, what to do about this? What to do? And we know that those, particularly in this flood of persons that would come through Europe in the early part of the 20th century, latter part of the 19th century, that were coming in particular from Eastern and Southern Europe, you know that they weren't welcome. Right. That they weren't welcome and that they were marginalized, derogated, denigrated in so many ways. So what do? There were many solutions that were offered to this problem. One was the solution, of course, it's nothing new that we're hearing today, sort of How many you gonna let in? The 1924 Johnson-Reed Act was a watershed period. It said we aren't going to let in any more than 2% of what's already here of any particular nationality, for instance. Others said, well, you know, President Coolidge, he wrote this article that said, whose country is it anyway? Right? And they suggested, and Theodore Roosevelt and others said, well, you know, maybe we can convert them, assimilate them into Anglo-Saxon culture and customs, right? I mean, someone like, go way back to good old founding father Benjamin Franklin. He was so worried that his beloved Pennsylvania was going to be taken over by swarthy Germans. True. So let me move quickly because I want to get to today. But so they said, so what do? We can assimilate them. But who's assimilatable? Who can pass as Anglo-Saxon? Who shows that they have the stuff that they can adapt, right? And still protect Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism? What's the criteria? Well, there's a story of an Italian who was running down the street and he was being chased by a mob of the old stock, those that came from Western and Northern Europe, and they were chasing him and calling him all kind of names, and he's hollering out as he's running down the street, but I'm white, but I'm white. Ah, white culture is born. Whiteness becomes that passport into the American space. Whiteness becomes that thing that's just enough that in which one can graft an Anglo-Saxon identity. And if you act like an Anglo-Saxon and look like an Anglo-Saxon, maybe no one will know that you ain't an Anglo-Saxon. But it was enough, in all seriousness. It was enough to continue the myth of Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism. And then a culture of whiteness is born. And when we talk about a culture of whiteness, I'm talking about that in all aspects of what that means, in its artifacts ideologically, systemically, structurally, and so forth. This is what we mean, in short, about the various ways in which whiteness stands its ground. Whiteness becomes that protective culture of American sense of exceptionalism. And American exceptionalism has historically and traditionally, and it's in our DNA, meant Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism. Be clear. And so what we see emerging today is nothing new. It's really about the truth of who we are. And it is a reflection of the fact that we haven't decided really who we want to be. What's the real myth? Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism, or that we are democracy for freedom and liberty and justice for all? Gotta decide that. So, what we see now are the various ways in which whiteness has stood its ground. You're protecting this myth of this Anglo-Saxon city on a hill. And it always transforms itself in ways that look appropriate to the times. And so even when people aren't talking about race, doesn't mean that they aren't talking about race. You don't have to mention whiteness to know that you're protecting whiteness, right? We don't have to talk about Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism to know that that's what we're trying to live into as a nation. So, what are some of those ways? Well, I don't have to really, I'm not introducing you to them. They're things you know, but it's always bears repeating when we can look at something like the prison industrial complex. Michelle Alexander, the wonderful author and lawyer of the New Jim Crow, calls it the New Jim Crow. And it is because the laws that, of course, allow for the thriving of the prison industrial complex aren't much different from Jim Crow laws, but I like to call the prison systems the new plantation. We know that African American males are 6 times more likely to be incarcerated than white males, and 2.5 times more likely than Latino males. However, 1 in every 6 Latino males compared to 1 in every 17 white males are likely to be incarcerated, and 1 out of every 3 African American males born today can expect to go to prison in their lifetime. 1 in out, yeah, I see the whoa. That's true. 1 in every 3 African American males born today can expect to go to prison in their lifetime. And we know it's not because 1 out of every 3 African American males grow up saying, I can't wait to go to prison. Something about whiteness standing its ground, legally, structurally, and extra legally, that creates the conditions that forces them into such a life against their will. The numbers are just as disconcerting, even more so when it comes to women, right? African American women are twice as likely as their white or Latino counterparts to go to prison. Now, how does this happen? We create the conditions. One of the conditions that allow for this, that nurtures, I like to say that we force people to live in realities that nurture death, not life. Yeah. Right? We create for them a culture of death. And then we are surprised when indeed the ways in which we have compelled them to live, they live into. Why are we so shocked when we look in certain situations and cities that are riddled with poverty, the conditions of poverty, the culture of poverty, that is inadequate housing, inadequate job opportunities, inadequate educational opportunities, inadequate health care, inadequate recreational opportunities, then inadequate opportunities to thrive. And then this is a culture of death. Then we're surprised because we say, oh my goodness, all of that gun violence, all of those homicides, look at them over there. Well, now you've just created, we should be surprised when people live, not when they die. Poverty is violent. When violence finds its way onto the streets, my friends, that's the violence that violence created. We have created a cycle of violence for which people are trapped. Right? When we want to talk about the school to prison pipeline, start with the conditions of poverty in which we force people to live. Because those conditions lead to the death that is prison or the death that is death. Right? So, by the way, we know that disproportionately, people of color live in these death-defying conditions. We know this. So I won't go through the numbers, but this, again, is the way in which whiteness stands its ground. We create conditions for people of color to die, not to live. We also create conditions that allow us to then live, to say, well, see, I told you that justify the stereotypes and caricatures of a people. We create the conditions to fulfill the myth of Anglo-saxon white exceptionalism. All right. So now, what are we going to do about it? First, let me say this. There's another way, which brings us here, particularly today, that whiteness stands its ground. Here's what I want to say. that even as we sit here and we can say and we see things and we hear things that people from the highest levels of power in this country say and believe, they just don't say it, they believe it. And we say, I don't believe that, I would never say that. I think of everyone as equal. What we don't recognize are the ways in which this culture of whiteness has been insinuated into our collective consciousness. That not only has it become a part of the nation's DNA, because it is a part of the nation's DNA, it is a part of our DNA, right? And so it's really, and I'm not talking to the folk that would demonstratively say, see, yep, I believe that. They are who they are. I'm talking about the good folk who don't recognize the way in which they indeed are fostering or nurturing this culture of whiteness and allowing it to stand its ground. So, let me point out a couple of things and the ways in which this manifests itself. And then we'll ask, what are we going to do about this? Recent studies, some of you may be familiar with this study, have told us that 3/4 of white Americans, 75%, don't have any non-white persons in their intimate circle of friends. 75% of white Americans don't have any, I didn't say black people, non-white people in their circle of friends. And of those who do, 91 out of 100 of those folks are white. Right? In the quarter that do, still only 9 of those folks are non-white. Think about that, in their whole circle of friends. And only one of those is typically black. Whole different spin on this, I got a best friend who's black. That might be the only friend you got that's black. Glad they're your best one. Right. So you say, okay, that doesn't make a big difference in the way I see my life and conduct my life, that just happens to be where I live or whatever. But it does make a big difference. It does make a big difference because it makes a big difference in the way we indeed engage the world, see the world, and recognize what's going on around us. So, for instance, by large measures, black adults are more likely than white adults to say that black folks aren't treated fairly. Now, I know you think, everybody believes in black, there's some unfairness, some racial unfairness. 64% of black adults say that, and only 22% of white folks say that. Can you imagine? 47% of black people have said that people have acted as if they are suspicious persons, or that people have treated them as if they weren't smart. Less than 10% of white people say that about their treatment. Black people say that they are more likely than black people are more likely to whites than say that they have been unfairly stopped by the police, and that they have been treated unfairly in hiring or job promotion. Here's a startling statistic. About 4 in 10 black Americans are doubtful that the country will ever make the changes needed for blacks and other people of color to have equal whites as whites. Only 11% of white Americans share this view. Are we living in the same America? Remember, 3/4 of white Americans have no people of color in their intimate social circle. So it is no wonder that we see the world differently. Right? One last little thing, then I'll talk about I'm looking at the clock, what we might be able to do about it. Sitting here, I don't want you all leaving depressed and saying that I am relegated to not only looking like a white American, but acting like one. Because you aren't. Because there's hope that actually you will act like children of God, but we'll get there. And as long as there's a God, there's hope. But I could give this other little statistic that shows the difference. In a recent study as well, 67% of white Americans believe protesting against the government's unfair practices are good for the nation. Right? We all agree with that, right? It's good thing. I always got a but. However, when a separate sample of white Americans were asked the exact same question, but the word black was added to it, black protests, that 67% dwindled down to 47%. All right? This is whiteness standing its ground in ways that we don't even think about. And we might think about our own views on things that we just never thought about before. The ways in which the privileges of whiteness have indeed insinuated themselves, unwittingly perhaps, into our very consciousness. So that, say for instance, when we hear about protests, we say, that's good. Then when we see black protests, aren't they grateful to be in this country? Oh, serious. Just in those little ways, and you don't even realize it. So what do? We're here in a church, and we're supposed to talk about, we all believe that there's a God, I suppose, and that we're connected to God, and we want to live into what that means. And that's what spirituality is all about, that connection to something transcendent, something greater than ourselves, right? Here's something very disconcerting. Forget that 81% of white evangelical Protestants voted for the vision to make America great again. And we know what that vision really means. And if we didn't know before, we should have. But if we didn't know before, we know now, because that vision is trying to be put in place to make America white again. It's a vision to protect Anglo-saxon exceptionalism. Be clear. We have to tell the truth about that. So forget that 81% of white evangelical Protestants voted for that vision. Take them out. So too did 58% of white Catholics and 56% of non-white evangelical Protestants. The majority of white American Christians voted for that vision. Period. What's that mean? We got to ask the question, what is the spirituality, the infrastructure of spirituality that sustains that? And what is an infrastructure of spirituality that can overcome that sustains a vision of God's justice? All right. Well, let me quickly go through this, and then what I say, and then we can maybe have a little bit of time, maybe a minute or two, for a question. Let me quickly go through this spirituality, and then we'll get a question. I just want to say that three things are essential, it seems to me, of a spirituality that will sustain the kind of world that God calls us into. One is, I'm going to use a couple theological words here, the imago Dei. That is recognizing, yes, that everyone is created in the image of God, but it goes beyond that. It says this: if we are to come anywhere close to understanding the fullness of who God is, then we have to understand that through God's very rich and diverse creation. Every single human being is a piece of the puzzle that reflects in some way who God is. And no piece of that puzzle is expendable. You ever tried to work out a crossword puzzle and you got a missing piece? It's not complete until you find the piece. The Imago Dei. You want to know God? You got to know everybody that is reflected in that reflects God's image. First, so I'll just say that because we have a little bit of time. You know what the implications of that may be. The other theological, so how do we get that? What is it that blocks us from seeing the image of God in others? What is it that blocks us from doing that? Well, we need to name it. And then we need to, another word is called kenosis. We need to empty ourselves of it. Self-emptying. Empty yourself of the daggone privilege of whiteness. And name the ways in which that has indeed become a part of your very spiritual self. Really. And don't strive for it. Just because you don't happen to look like a white American don't mean you don't act like one. So, so I'll just say that. Jesus' profound self-emptying happened on the cross. He refused to allow anything to be a part of himself that separated him from the most marginalized in society, the crucified class of the world. And so he was crucified on the cross, and crucifixion wasn't for the rich and powerful. Crucifixion was for the outcast, the marginalized, the enslaved of that time. That Jesus went to the cross was his ultimate self-emptying, his ultimate solidarity with what I call who are the crucified classes of our world? Who are the people? Where are the crucifying realities? Remember what I talked about? Cultures of death, they're crucifying cultures. It is to those people, with those people, that we are to find ultimate solidarity. It is through them that we're to understand the meaning of God's justice and the meaning of God's freedom, because when they can say freedom, when they can say justice, then we know it's come. All right? Kenosis. So we're called to kenosis. Right? Emptying ourselves of that which would not allow us to see the image of God that is reflected in all the pieces of God's creative puzzle. Then the last thing I'll say, I like to call it the incarnational reality, and it might come first. Jesus came and God became us, one of us. Right? To know what we know, to feel what we feel, to yearn for what we yearn for. So it was that as God became incarnate, this is where we get this sort of notion of the golden rule, so that God could understand what we need, where we are, who we are, right? I invert the golden rule, sort of the incarnational notion of the golden rule. Do not withhold from another that which you would not want withheld from yourself. You want food? Don't withhold it from another, so do they. You need water? Jesus, I like the story of him at the Samaritan woman at the well. Jesus said, I thirst. Letting the woman know that he feels what she feels because she came looking for water, and I'm not going to withhold water from you if you don't because I don't want it withheld from me. You need a place of welcome to feel respected. You want to be free? Who in here wants to be free, to live into the fullness of who they are? Y'all want to be free? Then don't withhold it from another. Don't. You want health care so that when you get sick, who wants health care? Don't withhold it from another. Do you want to walk down the street and feel like you can walk down the street and not be killed just because you walking down the street and looking like you look? Who wants to walk down the street and feel safe? Then don't withhold that privilege from another. So that's what it means by incarnational. You know, you see yourself in them, you see them in you, and you say, what I want, they want. What they want, I want. That's a spirituality, the infrastructure of a spirituality for justice. That's the infrastructure for a spirituality that gets us beyond the realities of whiteness. Okay, I'm going to shut up. I'm going to end there, I know, and see if there are questions, anything. Just a little tease to think about, right? To think about how we got here and how we going to get out of here. Let me invite you to this. This country may have not as yet to decide what kind of nation it wants to be. But the mere fact that we sit here and claim to be children and people of God, guess what? You've decided. However, not quite sure. Majority of white Christians voted for a different vision for America. And so here's the thing. If you've really decided, then we can't remain silent. Well, in there, I think, question.
Can we go to Janelle here, real quick? I invited you here to ask this question. So.
Uh-oh. If I got
Hi, my name is Janelle. The question that I have been wrestling with over this past week is the fact that the language of white evangelical church, white evangelicals have been a household name since the 2016 elections, but there are other theological traditions that white people belong to, Catholic Church, Episcopal Church, Anabaptist tradition, some Pentecostals, et cetera, et cetera. So my question is, are there things within those traditions that evangelicals can learn from, or does whiteness trump these theological traditions? Does whiteness infect these theological traditions so deeply that the baby is sick from the bathwater?
Well, yes and yes. First of all, here's the thing, and just as I just stated, we focus on this quote-unquote 81% of white evangelicals, or we focus on this base that people keep talking about, and we have to realize, as I said before, that non-evangelical whites also supported this vision. The other thing that we have to, so that's one. The other thing that we have to recognize is this is nothing new, that there's a long tradition of Christianity providing a sacred canopy for the Anglo-saxon vision of America, and in all of the ways in which it has manifested itself. And so the question is, what is the theology that of white Anglo-Saxon conceptions of racism that has become, there is the apex, just as there was an apex in the 18th century, late 18th century of scientific racism, there was an apex of religious racism, right? And so one, and I don't have time to go into detail, so that's always been present in very obvious ways, and then in more implicit ways. Here's what we should know about power. One of the ways in which this kind of oppressive, denigrating power sustains itself is typically, power doesn't sustain itself typically by being coercive, because people rise up. Power sustains itself, as Michel Foucault, a philosopher, says, by being productive. It produces the knowledge and the discourses it needs to sustain itself so that it appears that the way things are the way they're supposed to be. And the religious communities provide that knowledge by suggesting that the way things are the way that God intends them to be. That's always been the case. Now, does whiteness trump, no pun intended, does whiteness begin to trump a different sense of vision of sort of God's justice that doesn't sustain, of what Christianity truly is about when we understand that in relationship to the one who died on the cross? My answer to that is simple: yes, it's sinful. It is a sinful, violent identity construct and culture. Because, first of all, whiteness emerges as a construct always in opposition to that which is not white. That's the way it emerged. It's an oppositional construct. And as such, it is a construct that is always denigrating and dehumanizing of that which is not white. In anything, any ideological system, structure, construct that is denigrating, dehumanizing is violent. And so it's a violent construct. It's sinful. And yes, you can't at once be, in the way in which I'm talking about this, you cannot at once be white and Christian. And that means you have to name the ways, you have to call out the demon. You have to name the ways in which you are white. And again, I guess reinforce, I'm not talking about folks who happen to look like white Americans. So you have to name the demons. So are there things that we can learn from white Christian churches that were not, I think your question that did not support? First of all, just the way I'm using whiteness, I want to say, not white, not churches that are white Christian in that sense of the word. But I want to pull us to other traditions. Yes, I'm sure there are. I want to pull us though to another tradition. And I want to pull us, for instance, to, in this instance, in this dichotomy, a black faith tradition. How come we don't look there? Because that's a tradition, theologically, when it's been at its best, that has always understood the realities of God's justice as opposed to the realities of human justice, and what it means to be free and move to work toward that. And so what do we look, and they've always, one of the key things in that tradition has been the understanding of the Imago Dei and a God that is free, which means that to be created in the image of a free God means that we are all meant to be free. So did I answer your question?
Yeah, you answered better than most people. You get theological.
Yeah. And so in this short way, there are theological prongs.
We need to get you to the 11:15 service.
I think there's one. Can we take one more? And I'll do it short because she's been like.
Sure, go ahead.
You've been like.
The
So
11:15 service doesn't always have to start.
no, it's gonna start on time. I'm gonna answer you. You got to do it in 30 seconds. I got a minute. Go ahead.
It's a big question, so it won't get answered. You're
But
probably
you were like.
yeah, we're probably familiar that we have several different justice resolutions that this church has, one of which is the racial justice resolution. One of the things that we're looking at is terminology, cultural humility. I like the self-emptying concept, that framework, the beloved community, all of that. We live in
You got 10 seconds.
Okay, multiculturalism and how that, we need to move beyond that to self-emptying. Just a few comments on that.
Yeah, and I don't like the term multiculturalism and all that because all those terms suggest, right, that everybody else that's not white is multicultural, right? So, I mean, because it's a way of othering, and it's also not a way of recognizing what's really going on. Let me just quickly say this. There are ways that we can live into this stuff in the church. One, what's the fabric of our church look like? We have to make sure that people are able to see the diverse images of God's creation in our church, in the icons and in the fabric of our churches, right? Jesuses of color aren't just for churches of color, right? And so that's the first thing, so that people can see, oh, a body of color is sacred. Right? First, so what's the fabric? What are the stories that we read to our children in our churches? What are the images in those stories? We know that there is a dearth. The American Library Association just put out the fact that the images of children of color in our books is pitifully, pitifully low. What does that look like? You don't have to have, it's always nice to have diverse congregations, but the 11 o'clock hours, Martin Luther King Jr. once said, is going to remain a segregated hour as long as our experiences are segregated experiences, right? So you got to change the nation in order to have a more integrated worship. So people who experience the same things worship together. So, we got to do stuff out there to change the way people live, but we don't have to have diverse, quote unquote, a diverse congregation doesn't have to simply express itself in terms of who's sitting in it. What are the ways in which we can bring the reality of God's very rich creation into the church without having to tokenize people who don't look like us? So, find those ways, and then white folks can talk to each other. You don't need people of color to talk to you about racism. You really don't. These are the things that the church can do. I'm going to end there. Thank you.